It's May 1498. We're in the Republic of Florence. Girolamo Savonarola stands accused of heresy. But he won't confess to such a grave crime. After all, why would he? He's no heretic. In fact, he's a man of God. He believes wholeheartedly in the message that the Lord has delivered unto him. But deep in the Bargello Palace, there are chambers renowned for making men change their minds. It won't become Florence's notorious prison until the next century, but torture already takes place here. The Bargello is already full of devices, mechanisms, and machinery designed to persuade. In the bowels of the palace, Savonarola meets his adversary, Il Strappado, a system of ropes and pulleys that mangles even the strongest of bodies and shatters the most resolute of minds. Savonarola is hoisted 4 times by the machine. He undergoes 4 agonizing drops, his shoulders contorted frighteningly behind him. The sounds of groaning ligaments, snapping sinews, reverberates off the walls of the Bargello's dungeon. And 4 is enough. He will confess. But then, by some miracle, his strength returns to him, and he changes his mind and recants his confession. But the machine doesn't care. The machine can go all day. Savonarola is hoisted up again, then down he drops once more, then back up, then down, and again, and again. Some accounts suggest he endures 10 more hoists and drops until finally he caves. He gives the interrogators what they want. And that seals the deal for Savonarola. He's a heretic, and now he'll die. He shows no emotion as he receives his sentence. After all, once you've experienced what he's experienced, death would be a release. This is the story of the Strappado. The torture of Strappado can be defined in different ways, but most share the same core elements. Generally, the victim's arms are pulled out behind them like a pair of wings, pulling the shoulders in a horrifically twisted, contorted position. The wrists are then tied together, and the victim is hoisted into the air. Their own body weight pulls them downwards, exerting sickening pressure on the joints. If you think that sounds bad enough, you'd be right, but the torturers seldom give up their chance to maximize the suffering they inflict on their fellow human beings. This is why things like squassation exist in the historical record, adding acute injury to the agonizing mix by dropping the victim from a height and catching them before they hit the ground. Other variations include attaching a heavy weight to the lower legs, essentially turning the Strappado into a vertical, gravity-assisted version of the rack, stretching victims until their sinews reach breaking point. The first records of Strappado emerge in Spain and Italy in the 15th century. In Italy, the unfortunate Girolamo Savonarola is one of the first people we know to have undergone the torture. In Spain, that dubious honour goes to Jaime de Montesa, but it's likely that neither of these unfortunate men were actually the first. Regardless of who was, though, the torment had become something of a trademark of the Florentine Republic by the late 15th century, and of the lords and dukes of the Medici, who ruled over the state both before and after. It has since spread across Europe and into the wider world. But how would this torment have felt, and what exactly did it do to the body? Strappado was designed to target the shoulders, twisting them horribly out of position until the joints dislocate. Artists' impressions of the torture show the humerus or upper arm bone pressing sickeningly against the skin of the victim's back as it's wrenched out of the socket in the shoulder blade. Needless to say, shoulders aren't supposed to move in this way. The body is not simply going to let this happen, and the muscles, ligaments, and tendons of the back and shoulders resist with all their might. This means an agonizing tug-of-war between gravity and the rope holding you up, with your soft tissue in between. Regardless of who wins, the outcome is the same. The soft tissue takes the full force and is torn asunder. The rotator cuff is where a lot of the force is concentrated. These are the muscles and tendons that keep your shoulder stable. The soft tissues found here can be injured in a lot of different ways, but when faced with the extreme trauma of the strappado, they basically have no chance. Especially when you're experiencing squassation, the grim sequence of hoists and drops that torturers use to achieve the maximum levels of pain. With squassation, it's not a gradual, uniform pull from gravity you've got to worry about. It's the acute, sudden shock of a fall that rips the tendons with a sickening tug. This practice would have generated an enormous amount of force, channeling right into your shoulder joints, resulting in catastrophic harm. Extreme nerve damage would leave your arms and hands permanently debilitated. Injuries to the brachial plexus, the system of nerves stretching from the neck down to the arm, which could cause lasting weakness, numbness, even paralysis. Meanwhile, circulatory issues are highly likely, with the arms and shoulders constricted into these excruciating positions. The process itself puts great trauma on the blood vessels in your arms, resulting in ischemia. In simple terms, blood can't flow to where it's needed. If the blood flow is restricted too much, tissues in the hands and arms begin to black and necrotize. Essentially, your flesh dies and rots while still attached to your body. In most cases, though, this would be the last of your concerns. You won't be around long enough to experience any of the strappado's long-term effects. The process itself won't usually kill you, and it's not designed to. What it does is set up a confession for the execution that typically follows. In Florence, Strappado is associated with some dramatic falls from grace. Girolamo Savonarola, for example, had quite literally been the de facto ruler of the state right up to March 1498, just 2 months before his torture and execution. But he was more than a political leader. He was also a preacher and a prophet, displeased by the ostentatious grandeur of the Roman Catholic Church. Savonarola began to proselytize a purer, more fundamental form of Christianity. In some ways, he was a man ahead of his time. Martin Luther was still only 14 years old when Savonarola was preaching his new ways of worship on the banks of the Arno River down in Florence. And it would be another 2 decades before Luther nailed his famous 95 Theses to the church doors of Wittenberg and kick-started the Protestant Reformation. But the Vatican wasn't interested in innovation and new ways of looking at things. They knew how to worship God, thank you very much. And the papacy wasn't too keen on having Florentine friars drawing attention to their private affairs either. The head of the Catholic Church at the end of the 15th century was Pope Alexander, also known as Roderick de Borja of the infamous Borgia family. While stories of wild Borgia excesses have probably been exaggerated a little down the years, largely centering on Roderick's illegitimate children Cesar and Lucrezia, there's probably still a degree of hedonistic truth to them. Also, the Pope had children. Popes weren't supposed to do that, although plenty did. So Alexander sent his men to Florence to report on what Savonarola was saying about him, and in 1495 the priest Sebastian Maggi issued his polite but forceful demand to the troublesome friar. Cease from public and private preaching until you are able to come to the Vatican's presence, not under armed escort, as is your present habit, but safely, quietly, and modesty, until we make different arrangements. Savonarola did not cease, and so those different arrangements were made, and yes, they were every bit as ominous as they sound. In 1498, Savonarola was condemned to trial by fire, the first in Florence since the 11th century. Incredibly, he passed his ordeal. A sudden rainstorm dampened the pyre and called a halt to proceedings, much to the annoyance of Alexander and his men. Had God intervened on the side of Savonarola? Probably not, but either way, this was far too embarrassing for the Catholic Church. So it was down into the depths of the Bargello for Savonarola to be lashed up to the Strappado and shown who was boss. Savonarola confessed he wasn't a prophet, he'd made everything up. Pope Alexander could go on living and worshipping just as he pleased. Despite his change of heart, Savonarola was hanged on May 23rd and his body burned to avoid any relic collection, though that didn't stop him from becoming a martyr for the Protestants who would follow in the next century. But even more so than Savonarola, Nicolo Machaveli is perhaps the most famous name to be subjected to the Florentine version of Strappado. And there is a certain bitter irony to this. Whichever way you decide to interpret Machiavelli's work, when taken at face value, treatises like The Prince advocate brutal tyranny from the ruling classes. This means Machiavelli's words supported torture and violent repression, even if the man himself didn't necessarily mean what he wrote. Machiavelli's star was rising, just as Savonarola's was falling. Not much is actually known of Niccolò before 1498, but he certainly thrived and flourished as a diplomat under Savonarola's successor, Pier Soderini. The return of the Medici family to the seats of power in Florence in 1513 was both a professional blessing for Machiavelli and a personal curse. It was a blessing because without the return of the Medicis, he'd probably never have written The Prince, and we probably never would have heard of him. And it was a curse because, in order to achieve his controversial immortality, he first had to take a trip down into the bowels of the Bargello and endure a few rounds with Il Strappado. Machiavelli took his own journey into the clutches of the machine in February 1513 after he was arrested on suspicion of conspiracy against the Medicis. For weeks, the accusations were put to him. 6 times he was hoisted and dropped upon the machine, and 6 times he maintained his innocence. Even with a body twisted by torture and a mind driven mad by pain, Machiavelli did not crack. But such resilience wasn't necessarily what saved Machiavelli's life. Political historian Graham Garrard believes that the only reason he wasn't executed was because of the amnesty called after Giovanni de' Medici was elected Pope Leo X on March 1513. But after surviving such a harrowing experience, Machiavelli more or less retreated from public life, retiring to the countryside where he wrote many of his most famous pieces of work, including The Prince. He seems to have been largely unfazed by his torture, and in the words of Graham Garrett again, he took his torture on the Strappado admirably well, even writing some amusing sonnets about it. So the Strappado may have become associated with the dungeons of Florence, but it was already being used in Spain by this time, and was still being put to use centuries later. The Spanish Inquisition were a truly terrifying group of religious fanatics, obsessed with rooting out heresy in the most brutal fashion. This meant using methods like the toca, which was essentially an early form of waterboarding, and the potro, stretching upon the rack. Of course, for men as brutal as these, they always loved the strappado, or as they called it, the garrucha or the hoist. Garrucha meant tying the victim's hands behind their back, lifting them into the air, and then, you guessed it, dropping them several feet before allowing the rope to pull tight upon their twisted limbs. Records show Jaime de Montesa being tortured in this way as early as 1487. Around 70 years old at the time, Montesa's body would have struggled to withstand the torment placed upon it. He swiftly confessed to planning and organising the murder of Inquisitor Pedro Arbues 2 years earlier. As a convert from Judaism to Christianity and an outspoken opponent of the Inquisitors, Montesa was a target basically from the start, and his confession brought him no leniency. 10 days later, he was beheaded in Zaragoza's Market Square. That same day, August 20th, 1487, James' daughter Leonor was burned alive for heresy. The accusation of heresy could mean a lot of things in 15th century Europe, and in Leonor's case, it just meant observing the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur, and for that, she died horribly. Spanish artist Francisco Goya gives us an evocative depiction of the garrucha in action. The sketch comes from the early 1800s, but it's likely depicting a much earlier event. But this is not to say that the garrucha, strappado, and similar practices had actually died out by Goya's time. In fact, they haven't fully died out to this day. During the Vietnam War, North Vietnamese forces used similar tactics on American and South Vietnamese prisoners, adopting a process known as the rope trick. Robert Weidman, a Navy pilot who ended up in North Vietnamese custody after his plane went down in 1967, explained just how much the rope trick was feared and how it helped North Vietnam achieve its aims. The rope trick hurts like crazy and will get you to say anything. But after President Johnson suspended the bombing campaign, they stopped using the rope trick. And then again, as late as 1999, 5 Bulgarian nurses and a Palestinian intern were arrested in Libya on spurious charges of deliberately causing an HIV epidemic at a children's hospital in Benghazi. The detainees were subjected to torture such as floggings, beatings, electric shocks, and of course, the Strappado. Nurse Snezhana Dimitrova outlined the torture she'd experienced between 1999 and 2003. They tied my hands behind my back, then they hung me from a door. It feels like they are stretching you from all sides. My torso was twisted and my shoulders were dislocated from their joints from time to time. The pain cannot be described. And again, during the Iraq War, these same methods were used during the interrogation and torture of Manadel al-Jamadi at the Abu Ghraib prison near Baghdad in 2003. Al-Jamadi did not survive his ordeal. Though several American soldiers were convicted of the maltreatment of the prisoners at Abu Ghraib, no one has ever been charged in direct connection with al-Jamadi's killing. Though undoubtedly lethal in some cases, Strappado was never supposed to be an instrument of murder. It's a method of questioning, of interrogation, of investigation. Only, as we've seen, it's not really very good at those things either. In the Florentine Republic, deep in the Bargello, there was no fact-finding at work. When Girolamo Savonarola was interrogated, his tormentors already had in mind what they wanted him to say. It was just a matter of seeing how long he'd last on the machine, and how many drops it would take, before he gave them what they wanted. It was the same story for Macchiavelli. His torturers would have got their confessions sooner or later. His skin was only saved when, out of the blue, one of the Medicis was made pope. In Zaragoza, poor old Jaime de Montesa was not questioned in any real sense. He was simply the victim of violent persecution on account of his Jewish background. Similarly, the case of Robert Weidman in Hanoi, he had little information to give. Instead, his suffering was a bargaining tool to make Lyndon Johnson cave to North Vietnamese demands. Neither Snezhana Dimitrova nor Manadel al-Jamadi were truly active participants in any investigation. They were just punching bags, ready to be mauled and humiliated by people who sought to take away the last shreds of their dignity. In Manadel's case, they took his life too. So, the Strappado might be many things, but it is not a method of intelligence gathering. The only answers you'll get from the Strappado are the answers the victim feels they need to give to make the torment stop.